Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the webinar about demystifying the FDA and the regulatory journey for faster and lower cost drug developments. So thank you for joining us. Just a little bit of protocols in the beginning here. My name is Kenan Rooney. I'm a vice president in our healthcare practice. For some of you who are looking for CPE credits, you have to answer at least 3 of the polling questions, which we'll be having during this call. And so I'll be popping in and out, delivering those polling questions. Be sure you answer 3 of them, and then complete the survey at the end. But you, for sure, to get the CPE, you have to at least answer 3 of the polling questions. We are going to ask that if you do have questions, that you put them in the chat, or put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Sometimes we found that some of our participants can't put things in the chat, but they fall in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that, so feel free to put the questions in the chat. And just to be sure that you can check the chat, can you answer the question in the chat or in the Q&A, what is your favorite ice cream flavor? So if you can put your answer out there right now, we know that you found the chat button. And then we'll be able to, at the end, we're hoping to be able to have some open Q&A if that's if we haven't gotten all our questions answered. And so here we go with some mint chocolate chip, coffee raisin, butter pecan, my favorite.
Pecan.
Yeah, butter pecan.
Yeah.
Coffee ice cream. Yeah. Coffee ice cream.
Good stuff.
So,
Nice. Cookies and cream. That's my daughter's favorite.
Okay, David Cronin, gotta be vanilla. Oh my gosh. Terry Whitley, both of you with your vanilla. That's awesome.
It's a staple.
So yeah, it is a staple on top of pie. That's what I say.
Right on.
All right. All right. Thank you, everyone. It looks like the chat is working. I'm going to pass this over to Marcia, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, Marcia, for starting this off.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kenan. And hello to everybody and welcome. And thanks for joining today. I'm absolutely delighted to have you. I am, again, Marcia Brown-Rayford, Vice President of RGP's Life Sciences and Clinical Development Optimization practice. And been doing life sciences all of my life, basically, since I was a teenager. So just super excited to bring you this content today. Of course, you can see on the screen some of my background. I cut my teeth at Merck, 2 stints, one on the clinical development side, and then went and got some MBAs and came back and started helping scientists to think like business people. I have the history with PricewaterhouseCoopers, same practice. And so we're here to have a conversation and do some co-presenting with our colleague here and partner, Demetrius Carter. So I'll hand the mic over to Demetrius to introduce himself and we'll dive in.
Yeah, thanks, Marcia. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. A little bit about Demetrius. I've been in the industry about 20 years in various roles. I started out in industry working with large pharma customers like Pfizer, GSK, doing some in vivo pharmacology work. And then I progressed my career into doing full clinical development work as well. At J&J, but I spent the last 15 years or so actually on the CRO side, providing clinical development support across organizations, including project management and clinical monitoring. Most recently, I've moved over to Synchrogenics, which is a Tatara company, and my role is responsibility globally for our regulatory services organization. That includes our regulatory writing as well as our regulatory operations or electronic publishing group. So yeah, looking forward to today's conversation and sharing some of those experiences with you, and hopefully we can give you some guidance on how to accelerate your programs. Marcia?
Awesome. Thank you, Demetrius. So we have similar footprints with supporting such companies and clients as J&J and Pfizer and things of that nature. So we're happy to share a lot of that guidance today. So as far as what we're going to cover today, what you'll kind of leave with insight on, and again, key lessons and key lessons learned, specifically with respect to COVID-19 environment that we're all living. We want to ensure that you have an understanding of the FDA, right? We want to really demystify the critical success factors and why it's important to really partner with the FDA and how you can actually do that. Some keys to navigating that journey. There are challenges, but how do you mitigate those and how do you anticipate those in advance? Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is around, cost efficiencies and ensuring that there aren't these, costly delays that can prohibit your programs. And so with that, we also want to talk about regulatory strategies in clinical development and provide some insight around emergency use authorizations. We've heard that, over and over with respect to COVID-19, EUAs, EUAs, EUAs. But how do you actually think about EUAs and emergency use authorizations with respect to your NDA, right? With respect to your longer term market projections for your compound. And then lastly, on that same COVID-19 front, what are some lessons learned, right, that we're hearing that we can now implement with respect to our more nominal drug development processes and that are translatable across other therapeutic categories? Okay, next slide, thanks. So here we'll hand it over to Demetrius to kind of speak to Certara and give some background on their organization.
Yeah, I thought it would be helpful maybe just to provide some context and a little bit more information about Tatara and the broader organization. You'll hear us talk about or oscillate between Tatara and Synchrogenics. Synchrogenics is a division under the Tatara umbrella, and so many of you may be familiar with Tatara. Some of the software platforms like Phoenix Wind Non-Lin and our SimSip software platform. But if you think about the role that Tatara plays, I mean our position is that we help companies accelerate their drug development programs, really from early drug discovery, looking at coming up with their development plan, looking at clinical pharmacology, picking the right dose, also looking at something from a biosimulation perspective. One of the things that we're very much keen to do is how do we use software, artificial intelligence, really to be able to create what we describe as model-informed drug development, right? So more in silico modeling and less reliance on in-clinic development. So trying to find a combination between the two to reduce that burden. Also looking at, really describing the dynamics of your pharmacotherapeutic, in the body. And so we've got a lot of scientists and subject matter experts across our organization that can really help you with the pharmacology and toxicology side of your business, but then also articulating those key messages, for the regulatory agencies is really important as well. So we were able to take that information, your data, the facts coming out of your research and your program to really be able to craft an important message in a format in a way that the regulatory agencies will accept through our Synchrogenics division. I would say on the other end of the spectrum as well, right? What happens post-market? And so we've got our evidence and access division that really helps out with their kind of health economics and outcomes reporting, really looking at how do you leverage real-world evidence for third-party payers and developing your strategies post-approval. So I would say Certara really has a continuum of various subject matter experts that can really help you across from very early in your drug development all the way through to post-marketing support.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Demetrius. And if I can just say this, if we can sit on this slide for a minute, I can just say this. Certara is a partner, of course, of RGP. We support each other in various ways, and I won't go into a deep dive there. But the one thing that I do know about Certara is that they are the best in the world at what they do. Absolutely the best in the world. So just kind of prepping us for the enlightenment that's about to be shared with respect to that regulatory journey. And I just wanted to say that, Demetrius, I think you guys are just absolutely fabulous. And we're all family here and great partners. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Marcia. I appreciate
and I mean that very, very seriously.
I'll get you that $20 right after the call. So
thank you. I'll be looking for it. Maybe I'll send you my cash app.
That's right.
but what we found is with respect to our life sciences clients and specifically pharmaceuticals, but this applies across biotech and med device as well, is that often sponsor companies, life sciences companies, don't have a great appreciation oftentimes, and we're just kind of seeing this as a trend, for having an end-to-end strategy for drug development. And then if we drill down with respect to regulatory, not a real appreciation for the fact that there really needs to be an end-to-end approach, an end-to-end plan, an end-to-end strategy for drug development, and very deliberate. So Demetrius, can you kind of speak to what those critical elements are and critical components that are really, needful for successful drug development?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on a little bit of it, but I think with starting with the end in mind is really critical, right? If you look at some of the research that's out there, and I think many of you are familiar with some of the reporting and analysis done by the Tufts Center for Drug Development, right? King Getz and Joseph Damasi, and they've talked about the amount of effort and R&D costs involved with developing and bringing a compound to market, right? The estimates are out there that it takes anywhere between 10 to 12 years, as well as over $2 billion in development costs, right, for a blockbuster drug. And so a lot of that is because of the inefficiency in the process that oftentimes companies are jumping directly into development and really have not developed their overall strategy. They really haven't even thought about the market itself, right? So, what is the addressable market? What is the reimbursement assessment? One of my previous roles, we were working with a medical device developer, and they had actually done all of the clinical work and human factors testing and everything, and was ready to go with their submission, but had never had a conversation around the reimbursers about what that looked like. And when they finally had that conversation, lo and behold, what they found is that their actual cost to manufacture was going to exceed what the reimbursement was going to look like. So they didn't really have a product at the end of the day, right? So that's really critical to understand. What is your reimbursement strategy? What does your profile look like in comparison to what's already available? What's state of the art? What is actually the standard of care, right? And if you're not offering something compelling from either an efficacy perspective or either from a safety profile perspective, you may not have a product or a product that you actually want to go to market with, right?
Yeah.
Non-clinical is another area, right, where you got to put the right level of effort. I think this has become really critically important and in view. If you think about what's happened with COVID-19 and the vaccine development, that particular data set, because we have not had the significant or robust amount of clinical data available as you would normally expect for an authorization, the non-clinical data becomes even more critical. And so they're looking at both your small animal and your large animal data, right? So much so that people have seen recently. I mean, there's a shortage currently of primates available for research because of the demand for providing this pivotal data. So, thinking through your non-clinical strategy, particularly if you're looking at limiting the amount of work you're doing in the clinical space, right? So, some of the traditional models that you're seeing where people are going through kind of your phase 1, 2, 3 into your pivotal study, right, is not necessarily the case anymore. As you can see with most of the COVID-19 development, most of those companies went straight from their non-clinical data into a pivotal studies, right? And so they were able to do that because of the robustness of the non-clinical data, but also the urgency of the situation. I'd also just point out is just understanding where you're going to actually file that. So that regulatory strategy is important because that may dictate your clinical development strategy, right? So if you're going into countries like Japan, like China, Brazil, you may have to do country-specific trials, right? Your global data may not be sufficient for you to be able to submit in those countries. So understanding that strategy up front, may inform what you're doing both in the clinical and non-clinical side. I would think lastly, I would just point out manufacturing strategy. So having a robust plan, understanding where your product's going to be manufactured, and ensuring compliance with the regulations is really important. So again, the difficult situation here is you've gotten through both the kind of clinical efficacy and safety profile portion of your review, yet you're not able to manufacture because your site has not been cleared, or you've got issues around stability, or how you're going to manage the logistics of your product is really important. So these are the things you need to think about, but holistically, I think the concept here is that you need to go into it with a full drug development plan that starts with the end in mind, and then kind of track your way back as to how you're going to get there through the different areas that you're going to focus in on.
Absolutely. No, that's great, Demetrius. That's fantastic. And we have a client we're supporting that, of course, will remain nameless, but some of the blind spots are associated with even even from a global supply standpoint, right? And just because, let's say, a compound was approved in an ex-US country, the client actually thought that it would automatically gain FDA approval. So not having thought through that, and that's where we kind of help to think it through and to help position for more, regulatory success. So as you mentioned, Demetrius, it's really important to begin with the end in mind. And we're finding that this is more common than we probably like to see with life sciences companies where there isn't a thought through strategy. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but thank you for that. That was very helpful. Next slide, please.
Yeah,
yes.
Hold on, Marcia and Demetrius, quick question. On these 10, Demetrius and Marcia, I'd like to hear your point of view too, because you probably might have different view. Mm-hmm. In our life sciences organizations, where do they trip up? Where's the biggest trip up factors? What are the top 2 or 3 of these that they have not addressed that trips them up, and what is the impact of that not being there, either from a financial or an operational or just a results perspective?
Scientific as well.
Yeah.
Demetrius, I'll put the ball to you and see what your thoughts are, and then I'll respond.
Yeah, and I'll go back to my starting comment, right? If you go back and look at some of the analysis, and this is really great information. I'm not taking credit that this is my work, but the Tufts Center for Drug Development has been looking at this probably for the last 15 years, and they've done some amazing work looking at the analysis around R&D spend and where what I would describe attrition points, right? Where do development plans fall out, or people give up, or either reverse course, right? And generally, it's going to be around the clinical development strategy. And the reason why is that oftentimes companies underestimate the costs associated with going into the clinic, right? The number of trials, the type of trials, the complexity, the size of the trials, the additional expenses. If you're doing patient-reported outcomes, right? The cost of devices, where your data is going to sit, how you're going to monitor that data, the analysis. So usually there's an underestimation, right? And I think I see this a lot, particularly with medical device developers, is because, the barrier for entry for a device into this space is fairly low, right? You can take a bioengineer and an idea, you can develop a proof of concept device, and you think you're ready to go to market, tomorrow with that, right? And not appreciating that you've got to build a safety and efficacy profile for your device, particularly if it's an interventional device, right? So, we're talking now where your costs can go up exponentially, where you're now talking tens of millions of dollars for a clinical development strategy. And depending on therapeutic area, you can now get up into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think this is the area where, again, the conversation with the regulatory agencies, understanding the landscape, right? So what has actually been done. So if you're looking at a drug, that's in a particular class, understanding what the standard was set by that particular drug as far as what type of trials and what type of data is available. Is any of that data repurposable, meaning could you use it to leverage and add to it, right? But I mean, oftentimes, you're going to have to replicate some of their safety and efficacy data, right? And raising that cash or making that investment in those development costs, I think, are really critical. I think the secondary piece here that I would say, in addition to that, is what happens if you fail to meet your endpoint, right? So I think that the very last point we put here, which is what is your backup compound strategy, right? So if you're into the clinic and you're not reproducing the results that you saw in vitro, in vivo, or you all of a sudden now you're getting a negative safety signal coming out of the clinic, what are you going to do? Are you going to scrap the program? Or do you have another compound that's ready to go that either has a similar efficacy profile or potentially offers some advantages from a safety perspective, and that needs to be ready to go. So you almost have to have a parallel track until you have confidence that you've got the compound that you're going to go for approval with, right? So understanding what that looks like and what that strategy is and being able to execute on that fairly quickly when you see failure.
I think that's great, Demetrius. And we're sharing a brain here with respect to the clinical development piece. There's oftentimes a lack of appreciation for what that really requires. And there's huge room and opportunity for optimization with respect to the clinical development phase. There's modeling and simulation that can be done, right, to help with those efficiencies and to reduce the timeline to market and to help accelerate and to have, quality quantitative analyses that can be conducted that can really reduce time, out of that whole continuum, that journey, and cost, of course. To Demetrius' point, we've seen where sponsor companies have fallen flat in this space where there was a failure to really anticipate and do the due diligence and to define a strategy with respect to the clinical approach. So some call that the, almost the valley of death. And so that's one. And then the other I'll point out, I agree with everything that Demetrius said. And one other that I'll point out is that market assessment, right? That pre-market assessment. Do you have a market opportunity, right? What is the landscape? And that really is going to help inform your clinical approach. It's going to help inform it in terms of what you are looking to prove with respect to your endpoints or your outcome. Those two, many fail to have an appreciation for what that requires. And if you look at the market, you look at the indication you're going after, what is that strategy? What are you prioritizing? Which would speak then to Demetrius, your point around having that backup compound. When you understand the landscape, what if our clinical development doesn't, isn't successful, and what if it fails for medical reasons, scientific reasons? There are about 85% of clinical trials fail for operational and not, scientific or medical reasons.
Right.
That says a lot, right? That says a lot. So I'll end there. There's a whole lot more that could be said, but I'll end there.
Great. Yeah, let's have our, oh, sorry.
Go. I'm sorry, Ken, please.
You guys, while we're just quickly, our first polling question for your CPE. Having an effective regulatory strategy is not a critical component to a successful drug development plan.
True or false?
True or false, yes. Great, thank you. All right, 30 seconds. There we go. Thank you, everybody. Clearly. False.
Yay.
Right.
Good deal.
You've done a good job.
Absolutely.
Right,
we have star students here. Fantastic. Okay, next slide. All right, the almighty FDA, demystifying. I'm going to throw this. We've said quite a bit, but, we found, and Demetrius, you can certainly weigh in, and you will weigh in on this. You're going to take it and drive it home here. But there's just this trepidation when it comes to the FDA and the concept that the FDA is an enemy. And we've had experiences with clients where the FDA, I told one client about a month ago in terms of a response that they got from the FDA, that the FDA just hugged you. The FDA just hugged you and gave you just this enormous amount of guidance and pointing in directions, and the FDA is there to support. I'm going to throw the ball in your court, Demetrius, to kind of help us with respect to the FDA and even leveraging emergency use authorizations as an example of how we can demystify the FDA in terms of interactions with them.
Yeah, thanks, Marcia. I mean, I think it's really important to understand what the role the FDA plays in the development process. I mean, to some degree, yes, they are a kind of a toll gate along the way. I mean, they have a responsibility to the public, very similar to what we see for the European Medicines Agency, the EMEA, and that is to protect patients' safety, but also provide some support and guidance on the development of new drugs and therapies, right? They actively want to address unmet medical needs across the country. And so they're actively looking to partner with you on meeting that standard. But there is a standard to be met. And there are requirements. There are things that you have to do in order to give confidence not only to them, but to other scientific advisors, right? If they're part of the advisory process where, other scientists and leading medical individuals across that particular space will be able to weigh in, and they also need to have a good understanding and agreement on the safety as well as efficacy profile. And so we're just going to use, for example, the emergency use authorization process, because I think for some manufacturers it actually has caused some confusion and is misleading, right? Because if you look at it on face value, you look at vaccines that historically have taken anywhere between 8 to 12 years to develop, right? If you look at some of the prior development activities, I mean, the most recent one is, the Ebola vaccine that Janssen has developed. I was previously involved with some work that Sanofi did to develop a dengue fever vaccine some years ago, and that program expanded almost my entire career when working at one CRO, right? So for about 8 years, and his program still had not completed by the time I left that organization. So it is a bit misleading when you look at what happened in the COVID space, because you're talking about essentially companies that started development at best in January of 2020 of last year, and we've already got at least three EUA approvals for vaccines here in the first quarter of this year moving forward. So that's an extremely accelerated timeline. So there's a basis for that, right? So I think if you talk about where the bar is, obviously in the EUA space, it has been lowered to some degree. The standard that you would have for a normal authorization has not been fully met. And so it is a temporary approval. So I think that's the first thing we should understand. And then in order for them to get full marketing approval, in those countries, they're going to have to still meet that original standard for the compilation of all of the safety data. Ideally, though, instead of actually having to use clinical data, they'll be using real-world evidence in this example, because they will actually have people who have been dosed on those vaccines. So yeah, so EUA very quickly. I mean, you have to have a confirmed public health emergency. That's got to be very clear to everyone. You need to have a meeting to discuss your plans, right? So you can't just submit an EUA without some conversation or expectation from the agency about what you're going to submit. They need to agree that there is a confirmed public health need, and then they can still, review that and disapprove if they feel like you've not met the standard going forward. But like I said, it is a limited approval. So after the emergency is actually under control, they do reserve the right to actually remove that temporary approval and require you to complete the NDA BLA process. So what's really clear in having these conversations or trying to get your product through, right? And you're going to hear this probably come up a couple different times in the conversation today, is, you have to engage early and often. And I think this is the biggest thing, is that, the FDA, may be overbearing, or, it could be something that you have some consternation about, but they do have a role to help you. And I actually have found that, for biotech companies, early, manufacturers in the process, that they actually bend over backwards looking for ways to help you, to give you the information, the guidance that you need, and set expectations about what they're looking for. So you need to take advantage of that opportunity, right? It's advice that the company, or sorry, the government agency is trying to give you about what they can expect. And if you're able to kind of check the box on those things, it improves your probability of success along the way. Going into the IND, ID, space where, you're looking to get into the clinic for the first time and develop your proof of concept, or to verify your ideas about the mechanism of action, that information is an opportunity for you to share what is your development plan, what is your strategy, right? So again, validating that you're going down the right pathways, thinking about ways that you can actually manage your data. So the quality and the quantity of the data is really critical during that time period as well. Marcia?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Demetrius. That's extremely helpful. Let me ask you this question, because there are clients that we're supporting, and with respect to EUAs, for many it's the first time, right? It's their first time having that experience and needing to deal with the FDA, under that particular umbrella. And the FDA will provide guidance, right? They'll provide templates and guidance. But there are gray areas oftentimes, right, that the FDA deliberately intends for creativity, right? And sometimes there are unique situations. What have you found that you can share, with us with respect to even making recommendations to the FDA, and how open they are, right, to recommendations specific to your particular clinical program or your particular compound, and especially in an environment like COVID-19, where there aren't just a litany of concrete answers, right? How have you found the FDA to be flexible and willing to listen to maybe suggestions from sponsor companies?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I mean, I sat through a talk with one of the manufacturers that's recently got an EUA approval for their COVID vaccine in the U.S. And one of the things that was really interesting is, there really was no guidance on the size of the pivotal clinical trial that they needed to run, right? And
Yep.
so you actually look at some of the variability across the different manufacturers. Some of them has been as few as 15,000 patients. Some have been as many as 50,000 patients, right?
Yep.
And the reason why you see that variability is, obviously they're trying to demonstrate efficacy, improve their endpoints. But quite frankly, there was no guidance from the agency about what was the amount of the data that they needed, right? So this piece
Yeah.
around quality and quantity is actually really critical.
Yeah.
So, the idea, the rationale they provided, which is that, they've provided their statistical analysis plan and what they thought the scientific and statistical rationale that made sense for them to be able to demonstrate both efficacy and safety. They also calculated in obviously patients that would be lost to follow up. Some of
Uh-huh.
these trials, patients never came back or they were never able to verify the information. So you had to account for withdrawal. So they actually thought about this and made a proposal that actually then was accepted by the FDA.
That's
So
right.
again, a situation where there wasn't, very pedantic advice given by the agency, but
Mm-hmm.
with the understanding that you've got a sound business case and reason based on scientific rationale for your approach that was acceptable,
Mm-hmm.
they were able to find a pathway forward. All right. So,
Yeah.
but this is an important point. I mean, the FDA is purposely ambiguous because it's not their role to tell you how to do it.
That's
Their
right.
responsibility is to provide kind of the boundaries and constraints of what we're looking for, but ultimately how you get there is a determination the manufacturer has to make.
Absolutely. That's a key point. That's an absolute key point that I want us to really walk away with. Specifically, as you mentioned, Demetrius, around statistical powering of our clinical trials. If in doubt, ask the FDA, right? Ask them, present your approach, present what you propose, and ask them, and you'll have it documented in terms of whether they agree. So we found the same. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we'll go to a polling question. Thank you, Kenneth.
So which one of the following is not a recommended approach to improve the probability of regulatory drug device development success? Early and often engagement with the FDA, leveraging IND IDE as an opportunity to preview available data, effective quality and quantity of clinical data. You guys read really fast. They're already answering.
Awesome. Awesome.
Understanding the expected safety and efficacy thresholds, and avoid interactions with the FDA at all costs. They are your enemies and to your success. So just a quick question while people are answering this polling question. Is there an option of like, talk to me about COVID and what happened? Did the EUAs get utilized for the COVID vaccines? Because this was an emergency. Wouldn't this have been the obvious place to do it?
Yeah, Ken, that's great. Great question. I mean, no,
Right.
this is exactly where this has been used. So if you look in the U.S., you've got approval for the Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and now recently the Johnson and Johnson vaccine for COVID-19. And all three were approved under EUA, right? So it's a perfect
Mm-hmm.
example where you've got a public health emergency, unmet medical
Mm-hmm.
need, and where to some degree you relax the standards, right? Normally you would have expected much more as far as data, both on elucidating the safety as well as efficacy profile, like some of the things that's coming out now. They would have been expected to provide much more data as it relates to efficacy against the various variants, right? So you can see that what you normally would expect, the bar has been lowered to some degree for these temporary
Yeah.
approvals because the urgency is there because of the public health emergency.
Demetrius, I'm going to read into something you said. Do you think this is, and I hope you hear this in the right way, a missed opportunity that some of the organizations sit a little bit too long trying to qualify and quantify their clinical data, then they had an opportunity to move a little bit faster through and go through an EUA doorway, and that people aren't, organizations aren't necessarily not taking advantage of, but they've done all the right steps. They're just waiting too long. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I think a slightly different approach when I'm thinking about it. My concern is that I think companies see these EUA approvals, right, and they've gotten them in less than 12 months, right, and they anticipate or expect a similar pathway. And what I would argue is that the FDA, the EMEA will at some point require, additional data, additional information that's going to allow for full approval. And so those full approvals may not come for, several months, several years to come because, there's a lot of missing information. I mean, normally what you would want to have ideally, particularly with a new class or a new drug or a new compound, you want to have minimally at least 2 years of safety data. So absolutely in none of these scenarios do we have 2 years of data, right? So that's a curious bar that has not been met so far in these particular vaccines. So that's just one example where, again, the real world evidence that we're collecting now will allow them to eventually have that data. But you can see that that's going to be at least if you assume that vaccination started sometime last year for those who were in clinical trials, right? You probably have at least another 12 months or so of safety data to collect before we have any kind of readout on kind of a long-term safety profile. And there's probably going to be some expectation that you want, even more data. So there could be some post-marketing and post-approval requirements for 5-year data and things like that, because particularly with the new mechanism of action using mRNA, I mean, that's still kind of a new area where there's not a lot of safety data. Any long-term effects, no understanding if there's any kind of teratogenology impact on pregnancy and things like that. So you're seeing some of those studies on pregnant women now starting to happen. We still don't know what it means for young children, right? Some of those trials are starting. So we don't have EUA approval for children, right? I think Pfizer has lowered the bar at 16, but all the other ones that have been approved so far are 18 and older. So there's still classes of population that still need to be addressed that are not covered under the EUA, which again, these are things you would have had to address under an NDA or BLA application.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, of course, your more nominal drug development process and timeline is, again, far more extenuated in order to test and assess these various demographics. The other thing to point out here is, again, EUAs are temporary. They're intended to be temporary. We're not looking to be in an emergency situation forever. And so, biopharma, biotech companies, med device companies need to be thinking about in advance as a part of that strategy, that development strategy. Okay, we need to now have a line of sight for full NDA submission because EUAs are temporary and we don't know, right, when they'll be retired, when they'll be rescinded and decommissioned. With that, maybe we can go to the next slide, Corey. So I'm not going to even tee this up, but in the interest of time, but those pre-submission meetings, we have sponsor companies that don't think that this is necessary, and they just kind of dive into moving towards their clinical development plans and approaches. Demetrius, just hop all over this in terms of the importance of pre-submission meetings and pre-submission engagement with the FDA.
No, absolutely. And what I would first say is I think actually one of my colleagues has joined the call. Her name is Elaine. And Elaine is actually, this is something that she is one of our regulatory consultants consistently preaches to her clients, is really about best practices for a pre-submission meeting, right? These are not only suggested, I mean, these are required by law, right? Under the FDA guidance, they have to offer you these opportunities to have a conversation. And there's critical junctures, right? You can have in pre-IND, you can have it into phase 2, right? Things of that nature. So there's various touch points where it makes sense. But ideally, what I would leave you with is, how do you take advantage of these opportunities when you have a captive audience with the FDA, right? Ask the questions that you really want to be able to understand, right? It's really about expectation setting. What is it that they're looking for? What are the expectations? And so that when you're going back and you're modifying your development strategy, you're addressing the questions that they expect to see, right? I think the challenges that we see is not necessarily that people are not taking advantage of these meetings. They're actually not listening to the advice that the FDA is giving, right? So and this is a challenge. Obviously, there could be some egos involved. There could be a disagreement on the pathway forward, and you believe something different based on what you've seen in the data and how you've actually analyzed it, right? But if the FDA has been very clear about what they expect to see as far as the amount of data, or the type of data, how the analysis should be conducted, and you're not providing that, you clearly now have put your application in jeopardy, right? And most likely you're going to end in a situation where you have a complete response letter where the FDA has said you've not met the standard that they've set for you, and you're not going to be able to proceed with your application, right? So, we've seen clear examples. I think one of the examples we saw recently, where it was very clear the FDA wanted to see 24 months of safety data. Going back to the previous example, the sponsor company didn't believe that was necessary. That with the good efficacy that they saw, as well as they had pretty clean 12-month data, that they thought they were sufficient enough to move forward. And the FDA came back to them and was very clear. We're not even going to review this, right? So unless you come back with 24 months of data, of safety data, right, we'll begin the process. But if you can continue with this submission, this is going to end in a complete response letter. And again, there's going to be time loss, effort, productivity, and no one wants that, right? So ultimately, the goal is to get a positive experience and be able to move forward. So I think addressing questions. If there's a disagreement, you need to come back with sound scientific rationale as to why you have a different view or opinion. You need to be responsive, right? So the ability to have these meetings, and then if there's additional data needed, right, have your stats team, your clinical development team on standby to write those regulatory responses. And then, again, those are areas in which our team has been really successful in being able to address FDA questions, EMA questions, and really put you in a position to go back. So sometimes you have the answers, you just didn't have it in the meeting, right? So it is actually maybe an additional analysis or a different way of presenting it, or what you thought was important didn't align with what the FDA is, and so repositioning your key messages could be the solution at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's great, Demetrius. And with respect to those complete response letters, key point there, we had a sponsor company that we were in talks with supporting, and they received 2 of those complete response letters. What that means is you have to go back, to the end of the line.
Yeah.
You have to come back and resubmit all over again. And there's a cost to resubmission, right? There's effort, but then there are submission costs, there are fees with the FDA. And this company had basically wasted about $6 million for that reason. And the FDA told them exactly what they needed to do. They didn't do it, but the 3rd time, I guess, was a charm. And they went ahead and, we kind of talked them through aligning with that, and they were able to get approval. So it can be costly not to do this and not to listen, and so advantageous and beneficial if we do. Okay, I'll throw the ball to Kenan for a polling so that we can advance our time here.
What are best practices that will enable a positive and effective pre-submission meeting with the FDA? Ensure to have and follow the latest FDA guideline documents. Pose the tough questions to the FDA upfront and actively listen to the answers. Hide as much information from the FDA as possible because they are far too nosy. D, determine how to meet regulatory requests and keep the FDA engaged. All of the above except for C. Just a heads up, we're in this is your 15-minute warning, everybody.
Yeah, in the home stretch. Yeah. Thank you, Kenan.
Yeah, here we go. Yes, all of the above.
Good deal. Awesome. So we understand that the FDA is not far too nosy. They're there to help its partners. Okay, next slide. Hop on it. I could say a lot about this, Demetrius, but hop all over it in the interest of time.
Yeah, we've talked about ways in which we can reduce costs and effort, and that's about working smarter, not necessarily harder, right? And getting the right information that's expected by the regulatory agencies. But one way of trying to accelerate the timeline is the use of technology. And so, what we've gotten here is just a sampling of some of the regulatory technology solutions that Tatara can offer across the board. And I won't touch on all of these, but I think, if you look about the way in the authoring process, using, standard templates. So we've got an authoring template suite that actually meets the ICH guidance and includes a toolbar that's very effective to making sure we're meeting the ECTD standards and guidance with regards to that. We actually have a global submit software package that platform allows for both a review of your information. So, part of the challenge in compiling a submission is actually being able to see all of your data in one place and making sure that the cross references actually are correct. And so you can share it from a team perspective using the web reviewer, the different modules. And so you can share that, based in a cloud-based environment. That's really important. One of the things that I will talk about just lastly is the use of artificial intelligence. And you'll see a lot of this coming on in the space. I mean, this is a new hot area, but how can you actually use things like natural language processing to actually produce text and actually reduce the level of effort? And so we've created some platforms using our ClinGenuity tools where we can actually draft a CSR for a study, reducing that effort significantly. Narratives, so you can think about a program which has hundreds, if not thousands, of narratives, and the ability to create those profiles in a fraction of the time, right? Using automation. And then I think the last thing I would think about is what is your plans as it relates to transparency? There's a real movement, across the globe in the sharing of information. I think I saw something in the media already that, for instance, Health Canada has already published the results of the Pfizer studies on their web portal and have provided an anonymized version of those data results, and we can expect other agencies to take a very similar approach. So think about combining the ability to author your document as well at the same time creating an anonymized version that can be used by agencies to be published so that you can share, with stakeholders, caregivers, patients, other, industries that might be interested in information. So data anonymization and redaction is really important because you can see a significant movement, particularly in Europe, and the EMEA is developing a policy 70 that you're thinking about, which is going to require manufacturers to provide this level of transparency on an ongoing basis. And so it could even be retroactive to prior approvals, which means you're going to see this influx or this demand for anonymized clinical trial results into the public domain. So thinking about these things, but really the point here is how do you use technology to drive productivity, right? So if we're trying to accelerate timelines, we're trying to reduce costs, we're trying to improve productivity. One of the great areas in which you're able to do that is really tapping into the technology space. And certainly if there's questions, we can share more about how we do that as Tatara.
Yeah, no, that's great. We have a very current example of a sponsor company that has been a month and a half, editing, formatting for a submission, and and we're talking an EUA submission right at this point, and we understand the environment urgency is the wisdom of the matter, and with AI and technology, that can definitely be mitigated, and some efficiencies can be gained there. We'll move to the next slide, but as we do that, or our polling, maybe do we have all our polling questions done? We probably do.
Yeah, but here, let's just do this one real quick, everybody. Only question 4. Artificial intelligence and technology can enhance the efficiencies of regulatory submissions in which of the following ways? Significant reduction in complexity, manual steps to prepare and submit regulatory submissions to the FDA. AI-assisted writing technology capable of generating 60 to 80% of draft reports, saving weeks of effort. Authoring templates. AI-enabled redaction technology for faster, accurate, and not, wow, what's that word? I should have practiced. Anonymization. Wow.
Yay, big word.
Yeah, it's a big word.
Yes.
All of the above.
All of the above. Beautiful. You guys are fantastic. You're fantastic. And I'd like to say quickly that Tatara is replete with former FDA agents and scientists, right, Demetrius? And many of them help write the regulations. They help write, just the guidances. So take it away, Demetrius, with respect to some lessons learned here.
Yeah, I know we're running on time and want to make sure we have Q&A. But what I would just say here, this is a good example of how we've been able to help a recent developer in the cell and gene therapy space, right? So they were using adenovirus vector, again, where there's not a lot of background or experience, right? There's more kind of cell therapy products that are out there, but you start thinking about kind of targeted point deletion gene therapy. There's still a bit of a unknown space. And I think the challenge here is that what happens when the regulatory landscape is changing. If you actually look at the regulations and the guidance documents here, they have been updated quite frequently over the last 3 years. And so to some degree, you feel like the target is actually moving, right? And so again, this is where we're talking about the benefit of actually having those conversations with the FDA. What is your approach? What data do you have? What is it saying? How does that relate to prior approvals or what they've seen coming out of other manufacturers, right? Because you want to be able to identify any deficits that you might have in your development program. That again, that's going to inhibit you from being able to get approval. So this is a really good example because when they first had a conversation with the FDA, they just didn't have enough information, right? They didn't have enough confidence to go into first-in-man trials, so they wanted more non-clinical data, right? So we had to go back and provide some additional large animal models in the non-clinical space, and so based on that data and that analysis, it was able to actually get successful approval of their IND and we move into the clinic. So again, without that feedback, right, we would have packaged something together to the FDA, would have fallen well short of their expectation, and we would have lost valuable months. For this is absolutely a orphan disease indication, but nonetheless, valuable time would have been lost without that pre-discussion.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Demetrius. And at that, maybe we can move to the next slide and just kind of wrap up and then open up to questions.
Yeah, I think my last slide here, I mean, it's just representative of, the idea about thinking through your regulatory strategy end to end. And we've talked about various points here, but, it is a kind of continuous loop, right? You cannot do it in isolation or in a silo, right? Your drug development strategy has to touch your clinical development, non-clinical colleagues, but you also got to think about what does that mean from a manufacturing perspective and what are you doing about your stability, for instance, right? How are you going to develop your key messages, right? So how are you going to pull in your medical writing team to be able to deliver those messages in a way that is acceptable to those regulatory agencies, right? Value is key, right? I gave the anecdote about a manufacturer who had not done their due diligence and really didn't have a pathway to reimbursement. So even though they thought they had value because the patients actually would be interested in the product, you found that your third-party agencies actually didn't agree with that and actually didn't value it in the same way. So that pricing and market access piece is really critical to understand. And you can do that. Not all of that requires the heavy lifting of actually running studies and trials and things like that. There is in silico modeling. We've talked about some of the model and drug development, model-informed drug development that we're doing at Tatara. We've developed a virtual patient model, right? So again, a in silico model that actually mimics what you're going to see physiologically in the clinic, and so you can use that as a way to bridge the gap if you're missing clinical data to some degree and present that to the regulatory agency. But just being thoughtful about how you use data analytics and that you're thinking about this whole cycle kind of end to end and the development process will help you improve your probability of success.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Demetrius. Just think modeling and data and analytics, predictive modeling is powerful in efficiencies, and we'd be happy to talk more about that offline. Kenan, I'm going to throw the ball into your court, and we can go into Q&A for any questions that I just have.
Thank you, Marcia and Demetrius. Everybody on this call, we have 5 minutes left. I haven't seen any questions come through the chat, so if you have a question, put it through the chat, or I think I have to enable you to speak. So raise your hand or give me a high sign here somehow for me to be able to open up your line if you have a question.
Or a comment.
Or a comment. Yeah, I've been asking my questions all along the way because I can't help myself.
Your questions have been fantastic, Kenan. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
So anybody? Yeah. No? Okay. Well, here, this is the contact information for Marcia. Everybody on this call, you will be receiving a copy of the presentation deck as well as this recording if you want to share. We will be sharing this with those that couldn't attend, as well as they're sharing it on the RGP website, and I think Tatara was sharing it too. So please, reach out to anyone directly with them for questions that you may have, or any ways that we can assist. With that said, Marcia, Demetrius, is anything you want to say in a closing remark?
I would just say thank you, Marcia. Thanks for the partnership, and I enjoy the conversation and the partnership with RGP Healthcare. So thanks again for the opportunity today.
Absolutely. And it's been a pleasure with you, Demetrius, as well. Thanks for joining us. And again, you guys know how I feel about Tatara and Synchrogenix. And I'll just say ditto to that. And reach out to us if you need support, if you even have a question to help you navigate your regulatory journey. You're welcome, Stephanie. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Take care. Bye-bye.